Man, what is wrong with all this? Oh, man, you were supposed to do this a long time ago. You know what? Time to do this episode that we've been talking a long time ago. Time for an FPV quad build. Time to finally do this because I promised you so many times. I promised you such a long time ago and I haven't kept my promise. But here it is, and let me show you what I got for you. I have got some mysterious boxes right here. And guess what? We're gonna have a look inside real quick. So this is going to be an FPV quad build, probably just like any other FPV quad build you saw on YouTube or you're watching right now, and you may be thinking, how the hell am I supposed to build this, or this guy is not providing enough details? Well, I'm gonna try to be very explicit in this video, and this video is gonna cover everything you need to know about building an FPV quad from scratch. So it's going to be a very long video, so buckle up, get some drinks, get some coffee, and stay tuned because it's going to be quite a long video compared to most of my videos. But before we begin this video, make sure to like and share this video if you find any value during any time of this video, and also make sure to subscribe if you aren't part of this community already. So let me begin first with what we will be doing in this video. So first of all, in this video we're gonna build a quad which is 100% similar to the quad that I usually fly in real world, in real life, meaning we will be building an FPV digital quad, an FPV HD quad which uses DJI HD system. Meaning I'm not going to cover, or I'm not going to dive into best budget options, into alternatives and all that stuff. So this is the part that we will not cover during this video. We will be building a copy or a clone of my FPV quad, which I usually fly. And let me show you what I'm talking about. I'm actually talking about this guy right here. So basically we will be building this quad from scratch. If you are interested into what I usually fly, we will be building this guy right here. So this video is going to be split in 4 parts mainly. So first of all, we're gonna cover the introduction of the components. Then we're gonna cover the introduction of each and individual accessory which you will need in this video. Then we're gonna cover the build itself, and then finally we're gonna cover BetaFlight configuration, meaning we're gonna learn how to configure your flight controller so that you can go out and fly your quad properly without having surprises and things like that. So here we go, let's go ahead and dive into the components list, the things that you will need to put in your quad in order to make it functional, in order to make it fly. And let's start with the first components, which are basically the video system itself. So let's put this away, and here goes the first component of the video system, which is the radio controller. You will need a radio controller in order to control your FPV quad, and we're just gonna buy this as a whole unit. So radio controller, unit number 1. The next thing you will need is the FPV goggles, which is also the most freaking expensive thing in this whole FPV system, but it's worth it, trust me. The quality of it is just whoa, it's just amazing. Basically here you have the FPV goggles. They don't look like that in real life. They have smaller antennas, they have antennas like these. So basically you will have 4 of these antennas. Basically these are small SMA antennas which connect and screw to your FPV goggles, so it shouldn't be a problem. I will leave that to you. As you can see, I have different antennas on top. different antennas on bottom, and this really looks weird. It looks like an alien or something. So next we have this small little cable, which basically is an XT60 connector, which connects to your battery, and then you have this little interesting plug which goes straight into your goggles. So you will connect them like that, plug in a battery, and here you go, you can see video in your goggles. Next, and also a very important component which comes into the DJI FPV system, is the DJI Air unit, which I have in one of the boxes. Let me look for it in this box, and here we go. Not needed, not needed, not needed, not needed. And finally, here we have it. This is the DJI Air unit which we will be using. This will act as a video transmitter and signal or radio link for your radio, which comes in with the FPV system which you will be buying from DJI. So let's move on to the next components, because obviously an FPV quad doesn't only consist of a video system, it also got many more interesting things. So this is the XT60 connector, which will be part of your quad, which is basically that thing that powers up your quad. You just plug in the battery in this small little thing right here, and your quad will have juice, you'll be able to fly. So you will need one of this, and link is in the description as usual. Next, we're talking about ESC, or electronic speed controller. If you don't know what ESC is, make sure to check out this video where I talk about all of the components which make up an FPV quad. And we will be using a Teco 32 ESC, which is basically a 4-in-1 ESC, which will allow us for a very clean build, and it performs very well. It's also compatible with the flight controller, which we will be using in this build. So that's pretty much it on this small ESC. It's a nice little thing which you will have to have in your quad in order to control those motors. Next, we're talking about the flight controller. So in this case, I bought, or we will be using, my favorite flight controller of all times, which is Kakute HDV F7, which in my opinion is the best flight controller on the market. I like it very much because it doesn't have lots of cables. Well, you don't have to solder lots of cables because it has the small little harnesses. So basically it's just plug and play. You'll have some cables when you buy this flight controller. And also, speaking of harnesses, this small little harness which connects to the ESC directly will automatically work out of the box, meaning the diagram or the pin layout is going to match 100%. So we have motors, and speaking of motors, I bought, my favorite motors. These are Lumineer 2306 170/50 kV Johnny FPV edition, and also these are Popo motors. Popo meaning it has this little thing which you could press, and basically these little things will just hide themselves and allow you to insert the propellers easily without having extra tooling and stuff. When you go out in the field, you forgot your tool, and then you're like feeling dumb because you can't tie up your propellers and you can't fly your quad. Well, Popo will solve that problem for you. Now, when it comes to motors, you can buy what I will recommend, what I will link in the video description, but you can buy really anything that go from 22.0 something up until 24.0 something. It's really up to you. Make sure to buy at least 4 of them, but my recommendation is buy at least 5 motors, because there might be cases and crashes where one of your motors may not work properly after a crash. So having one extra motor at least is a good thing. So speaking of motors, motors come hand in hand with propellers. So make sure to buy a decent set of propellers. Right here I have T-Motor 5-inch propellers. So these are also my favorite propellers so far. They're so sharp, they're so thin as well. I've crashed so many times with these propellers, and the durability of these propellers is just amazing. So make sure again you buy anything that's a 5-inch propeller, and also make sure that you buy Popo compatible propellers. They will have a small icon called Popo, which means they will be compatible with your motors. If you're buying Popo motors, again, make sure your motors are Popo, make sure your propellers are Popo, because otherwise you will have incompatibility issues. Make sure you buy at least 2 or 3 sets of propellers, because you will break some props or you will bend some props, and you don't want to find yourself having a bad flight experience just because you have a prop which is not well, it doesn't work properly. Moving on to the next components, and another important component which I think is a must in every quad is having a buzzer. Now you can set up your motors to beep whenever you crash, whenever you lose signal and stuff like that, but I like to have dedicated things like buzzers. So that's why we will be using a buzzer from iFlight. Again, link in the description. This is a very nice buzzer, really reliable buzzer. It has a very loud beep, and yeah, I will link everything in the description. This is a very high quality, and in general, everything from iFlight is my recommendation. And this buzzer from iFlight saved me a lot of the times when I lost my quad. I would just flip up one switch and the thing would start to beep, and I would find my quad very easy. So having a buzzer is a must. I will include this in the video description below. Again, it's optional, but once you lose your quad, it's your responsibility. It's not going to be my responsibility to find your quad. So make sure you have something which is going to save your quad whenever you lose it. And we're moving on to the next thing called the GPS. So I recommend this Maytech GPS. It's a little bit of an expensive GPS, but nevertheless, it will provide you with a very good experience. It's going to give you home direction. It's going to give you your speed while you're flying. It's going to give you latitude, longitude, all those things which GPSs give. And again, it's an optional thing, but I like to have this in my quad because sometimes I lose direction. Sometimes I don't know how far am I from home. Again, it's optional. You can buy it, but you will not die or you'll not crash just because you don't have a GPS. However, we will be using a GPS in this quad. Another thing which is also important in my opinion, and I should have talked about this in the XT60 connector section, is a low ESR capacitor or any kind of capacitor in general, but I recommend low ESR, and I will be using this capacitor from Panasonic. Again, link in the description below. It will allow you to have clean voltage. It will allow you to have a better flight experience without, I don't know, you may fry things just because you're messing around with the throttle too much. So I like to have capacitors to save up my butt. And we will be using this specific capacitor. You could use a smaller capacitor, which I believe comes in the same box with the Teco 32 ESC, which we will buy. Next, we have these cables. Again, these cables or harnesses will come in the same box when you buy the Teco 32 and Kakute HDV F7 flight controller. Next, we have a small little thing. Again, it's optional, but if you find something like this on Amazon, or if you have a 3D printer, you could print it yourself. I 3D printed this myself. I'll link again the 3D model. If you want to 3D print this yourself, feel free. Next, we're talking about battery straps. Basically, you will need battery straps, at least 2 of them. If we're talking about a 5-inch quad, you'll need battery strap to tie up your battery when you fly, and if you crash, you don't want to lose your battery or something. These battery straps come in the frame itself, which again we'll cover very quickly, but make sure to have decent battery straps. Also, if you plan on flying 6S like I do, you could have bigger battery straps just like these from Ethics, link in the description below again. As you can see, these battery straps from Ethics will allow you to have a pretty big battery, and 6S batteries are pretty big usually. So next we're talking about something which I think is very, very important, and we're talking about the FPV quad frame itself, which is that carbon fiber frame which you build or you stack everything on. So let's open up this real quick. And as I said, you get some battery straps, and then you have some nice 3D prints. Then you have these little things which I believe are to tie up your motor wires. And then you have the frame itself, which is basically carbon fiber. We'll cover this, we'll unwrap this and build this in the build section itself. As I said, having a nice frame is a must, and that's why I recommend the iFlight Titan XL frame, which is by far the best frame in my opinion. I love this frame. I will always fly this frame for now. Another optional thing which you will have to have in your quad, well, again, this is optional, but you will want to have something like that in your quad, is a GoPro. And you could buy a GoPro Hero 6, Hero 8 or Hero 9. Why exactly I recommend these versions? Well, because they work the best with the real steady software stabilization. And yeah, again, I will be using the GoPro Hero 9, which is the latest version. You don't have to use the Hero 9, you could buy a Hero 6. A Hero 6, in my opinion, is going to do the job. It's going to bring you stable footage, but yet again, this is something optional. You don't need to have a GoPro in order to record nice video, because the DJI Air unit is going to provide that already. Speaking of GoPros, if you buy a GoPro, you will also need to buy a GoPro mount, something that's going to hold up that GoPro, because when you buy that GoPro, the moment you're gonna crash probably is going to be the moment you're gonna have to fix your lens, or you may break a lot of things. That's why you wanna buy something like this, which is basically going to protect your GoPro. And again, I cannot recommend anything but iFlight because they sell the best things, and in fact we're gonna be using the iFlight GoPro mount, which is for Hero 9 specifically, but they have for Hero 6, 7, I believe 8 as well. And yeah, just make sure you buy one from them. I'll link everything in the description as I mentioned before. Speaking of the frame itself, also make sure to buy some extra set of screws and standoffs and soft mount utilities, because you will need these. As I said before, the frame might not cover everything. That's why I love to have extra stuff. I learned the hard way when I first built my quad. I realized I didn't have enough screws. I realized I didn't have the proper screws because I wanted to put a 3D mount skid or something, and it just not worked properly. That's why having extra screws is a good thing, but yet again, it's optional. So I will link everything in the description. Make sure to check that out yet again. Speaking of your power supply, you will need batteries. And in this build, I'm gonna try and make this quad specifically for 4S batteries, but you could use them for 6S batteries as well. I recommend this brand because they're very good, very cheap, and straight to the point. I recommend China Hobbyline batteries. I recommend buying at least 4 of these batteries. Why? Because you will need at least one of this to power your FPV goggles to see your video, and you will need at least 3 batteries to understand something out of your flights. Speaking of batteries, you will need a battery charger. Again, you don't have to buy this expensive battery charger. This is not a cheap battery charger, but it's very good. It has something like 200 watts AC and 650 watts DC. It provides up to 15 amps. I'm gonna link this one in the video description below, and I'm gonna provide some cheaper options. But if you wanna buy a good charger, make sure to buy this. I believe it's Hobbymate or Hobbywing, I don't know. Yeah, it's Hobbymate Smart Charger. It's not a cheap charger, as I said, but it's a very good one, which will allow you to charge your batteries fast, safe, and it's just such a nice charger. And also something which is optional, you may want to buy something like this, which is a parallel charging port, which basically will allow to charge multiple batteries at the same time. However, there are details, there are things which we have to understand before we proceed. All right, now let's go ahead and dive into the accessories list, which are those things nobody talks about when building an FPV quad. However, they are necessary, otherwise you will have the components, but you will not be able to build your quad. So first and foremost, you will need something called electrical tape. Well, probably you already got something like that near you or around you. So here we go, I have some electrical tape right here. We have multiple types of electrical tape. So as you can see here, we have the basic one, which is the black one. We will primarily be using this electrical tape. However, you can have multiple colors if you want to mark something out. Another type of electrical tape is the double-sided electrical tape. We will be using this one specifically. In this case, I'm going to try to tape down the buzzer underneath the FPV camera, and I'm going to show you exactly what I mean in the FPV build itself. You will as well need a pack of zip ties, so make sure you buy a pack of zip ties. These are very cheap and they have different lengths of zip ties. So again, zip ties are a very useful thing, especially when it comes to FPV. Next on the accessory list, we have the soldering iron and the soldering wire. We will primarily use these two only, especially because we have to solder electronics, we have to connect things and make them communicate, and this is the primary thing that you'll need. You don't need to go too expensive on this one. This soldering iron, for example, is not expensive at all. But as I was saying, you will need a soldering iron. This one is very cheap and has lasted me forever. This is 100% the first tool that you will need in order to build your FPV quad. So that's why this is the accessory number 1 which you want to have in your box. Now, speaking of soldering iron, you will as well need soldering wire. Now, soldering wire, I recommend buying at least 2 of these packs. So speaking of soldering wire, you'll of course need something like a wire cutter, because there are different kinds of wires. You have to strip wires. You need a wire cutter if you got soldering wire. So that's why I recommend buying this Boeing Fu wire cutter. This is a very good wire cutter. I've had a very good experience. That's why I recommend having this. and you will need to have one of these anyways. Speaking of wire cutter and wires in general, you will need something like this, a wire holder, because there are different kinds of wires, and especially bigger wires like wires from the motors, wires from the XT60 connector will require you to have something like this in order to hold it properly, because when you solder, things get very hot and you will need something to hold those wires. Speaking of soldering iron, make sure it comes with something like this, which is this little thing that's gonna hold that soldering iron, otherwise you're gonna melt things around. So make sure you have something like this. And also, speaking of that metal plate, I also have this metal plate, and in conjunction with electrical tape, you could tape things on this one and things will stay stable and you will be able to solder without worrying about things moving or shaking. And speaking of things staying stable, you can also buy something like this, which is basically another metal plate which has these little helpers, and these little helpers, come on, get on, are magnetic. So basically you can attach these helpers here and there, and you could, I don't know, position them. That's why, again, this is something optional. However, I'll be using this in my build in order to make sure it's going to ease the process and I don't need to worry too much about soldering at all. Speaking of your frame, it's going to have lots of screws in place, and in general, an FPV quad is going to have lots of screws. That's why you will need specific screwdrivers, and specifically we're talking about these hex screwdrivers. I'm gonna link everything in the description. Again, make sure to buy the whole set of screwdrivers from Hobby Ace, because these are going to be very useful. These are much better than the ones that come in the box. Speaking of soldering wire, soldering iron and stuff like that, you will need something like a sponge. So make sure you find any sponge around you and make sure it's wet, because you will need this to make sure to treat your soldering iron properly. Otherwise, it's going to damage over time and you want to keep it in a healthy state. That's why a sponge will do this job. So we will be using the sponge in this build. Another thing, which again is not required, however, you feel soldering on a table, or if you don't have a specific dedicated table, I don't know, I recommend buying something like this. Basically, this is a soldering mat, and everything that you solder on this. This is made of silicone, so basically the metal things and the electronics will not fall out of this, and it's just convenient, it's easy, and you could use this to solder on pretty much any surface, including your kitchen table if you want. So make sure to buy one of these. It's again optional, but I think it's useful, and we're gonna be using this in this build. All right, gentlemen, that was pretty much it on the components and accessories list. Now let's jump into the actual meat of this video of building this FPV quad. Let's jump into the build. I'm gonna walk you through every step, so don't you worry about soldering or anything like that. I'm gonna walk you and teach you how to do soldering and everything. So let's dive into the actual build itself, and let's start with the FPV frame, assembling it, then moving on as we go. So here you have the box, and as you can see, here we got this carbon fiber frame itself. So let's open this up, and yeah, as you can see, we have this legs, and then we have the main plate and the top plate right here. And here you have the doors for the camera. Here you have some 3D prints. As you can see in the box, you also got these little stickers which you can put on top on the top plate. And you have a couple of things for the GPS and antennas. And you have the screws. And you also got a small diagram in the box showing you how to do this. So make sure you follow this diagram. Make sure you have the actual carbon fiber plate and the screws on the table. And let's give this a start. Alright, we're almost done with this frame. All we have to do is just tie in a couple of things, and I think we're done. So let me just tie these little things just like that. Make sure they're pretty tight, because I'm gonna mount everything on top of this. Also make sure to tie them up using the screwdriver, because they might be jiggly, they might rotate, and you don't want them to rotate, you want them to be as tight as possible. So as you can see, this is going to be the front, this is going to be the back, and this is how we're gonna mount the camera, but we're not going to do it now. We're gonna do this a little bit later. Right now, let's also mount this So basically these are like the legs. They're gonna help the quad land, and basically it's gonna be more convenient. Let's also mount these little guys. This one should go right here, and this one should go right here. And we're gonna take care of mounting the FPV camera a little bit later. Speaking of the air unit, these are the mounts for the air unit. And keep in mind that these are pretty tough. You have to apply a little bit of force in order for you to make it. And then have to push down until it reaches the bottom. Again, the same for this one. So it took me a while to set the whole thing up. Even though I have the same frame, I still forgot how to put this thing up. That's why I needed to see which screws goes where. And I hope you guys took your time to set this up correctly, because based on this, we're gonna have to continue the whole build. So take your time. It doesn't really matter how much time it takes. Take your time to put the whole frame together. Next, we have to go ahead and solder things around, place things on top of this stack so that we put the whole thing together, and then we can consider this done. All right, now that we're done with the frame, I decided to give you a quick lesson on how to do soldering. So it's gonna be some soldering 101 for those who don't know how to solder at all. And why do I need to cover this? Well, because I think this is very important. A lot of people just tell you, tin the wires, tin the pads, and this is how it's done, and this is pretty much it. But they don't tell you the technique. They don't tell you how they do it, resulting in very poorly soldered wires, resulting in a bad build if you're just watching what they do. That's why I decided to give you a quick tutorial on how to do soldering. So first of all, make sure to have a wet piece of sponge. Make sure you steal one from your kitchen or whatever, it doesn't really matter. Bring a wet piece of sponge because you're gonna need that. After that, make sure to connect your soldering iron and make sure you don't touch it, otherwise you're gonna have some burns. And of course, in my case, I'm gonna have a piece of wire, a piece of a thicker wire, and a piece of electronics which is broken, which I don't need. We're gonna use these two to teach you how to do soldering. You don't necessarily need to practice it right away, but the same technique, the same things that I'm gonna teach you in this small tutorial will apply in our build. So depending on the thickness of the wires, basically you will adjust your soldering iron for a certain temperature. For wires like motor wires, XT60 connectors, I would use something above 300 degrees. Anything else which is smaller wires, like wires which are going to be soldered for TX, RX and stuff like that, will use perhaps something like 200 degrees or less, or 250 degrees. It doesn't really matter. What I'm saying is the thicker the wire, the more you'll have to increase the temperature. So first of all, after the soldering iron is already hot, all you have to do is basically take a piece of soldering wire and make sure you apply some wire on it, and this is healthy for your soldering iron. After that, you do like that on your sponge. You basically pre-tin your soldering iron, and this is a necessary step once it's plugged in, once it got hot. After that, there are two steps you will have to apply. You'll have to pre-tin or tin the wire and tin the pads. What that means, you'll have to apply soldering wire on the wire itself, and you'll have to apply soldering wire on the flight controller or on the pads which you're planning to solder. So let's do that process, but before we do that, let's go ahead and make sure we strip this wire so that it's clean. So I'm gonna use a wire cutter and I'm gonna strip this one right here, just like that. And after it's stripped, as you can see, it has wires. Make sure you straighten it up like that a little bit. And then after that, I'm gonna use my little helper and I'm gonna start tinning the wire first. So tinning the wire should be pretty straightforward. All you have to do is just make sure you melt this soldering wire around this little wire, just like that. So basically you apply and you try and make sure you spread this soldering wire everywhere, otherwise the connection is not going to be that good. So I'm gonna do it like that, and I'm gonna clean the soldering iron as usual. And because this is the soldering wire, because we are gonna try to melt this one on top of a specific pad, I'm going to apply a little more soldering wire, just like that, so that we have the small little bubble. In my opinion, a correctly soldered wire would look something like this. Come on, focus. You'd have that small little bubble. Now let's go ahead and tin those pads, because we have to melt in the wire to the pad, and basically that's how they get a strong bond, that's how they get a good flow. Next, what I'm gonna do is going to use my metal plate, which I was talking in the beginning. So I'm going to use a metal plate, then I'm going to put this flight controller like that and go ahead and use a piece of electrical tape. And let's make sure we cover this and make sure it's tight so that it stays in one place. So after that, it should be looking something like this. So as you can see, it's not moving, and if I try to solder, things are not going to be shaking. And after that, let's tin those pads. So it's pretty simple to tin the pads. All you have to do is heat up the electronic just a tiny bit, not too much, and apply the soldering wire just like that, and make sure you spread it across the entire pad. And then you have to do the same. As you can see, I am heating up a little bit the electronic, but it's already hot. So then after that, I'm applying this wire over here, I'm melting it off. And again, I have these nice little bubbles. At the end of it, it should get something like that. You should get a nice clean 2 pieces of bubble, meaning you tinned your pads correctly. And now that you tinned your pads, now that you tinned your wires, all you have to do is just melt the two and make them flow together, make them bond so that you have a very strong connection, so that electricity can flow through those wires and then through the electronics. So again, let's make sure this one is tight and it doesn't move. After that, I'm going to take the wire, and because the wire is quite thick and when heating the wire up is going to get hot, I'm going to use this wire holder. So one way that I learned how to do this correctly is heat up the electronic first, or heat up the flight controller first, then quickly after that, don't waste too much time, heat up the wire, then put the two together, make sure they're close enough, and heat both of them at the same time so that they flow. So I'm gonna start heating up this one. So once I see this pad is heated up and it's moving correctly, I'm gonna heat up the wire, then make sure the two of them are close enough, then heat both of them at the same time, just like that. And once I see that the soldering wire is kind of flowing, I'm gonna let it cool. And you should get something like that at the end of the process, you could say. So if you could pull it off like that, like it's pretty hard to pull this thing off. Like if in case of a crash, in case the battery is going off or something like that, this is not going to affect your quad at all. You will not lose energy because you made sure the bond is strong, because you made sure the current is gonna flow and nothing will break. If you do things otherwise, if you're trying to apply heat only on the electronic or only on the wire, things will probably not flow, things will probably not go as you intended. So this is soldering 101 for those who are beginners to soldering at all. Alright, so now that I showed you how to do soldering 101, let's dive into soldering right away, because we have to solder the ESC to the XT60 connector, because this is basically the way that we're gonna allow juice to flow through our quad. So you will need to have the ESC, which I linked in the video description. Then you will need to have an XT60 connector, which I showed you before. Then you will need to have a capacitor of your choice. I'm going to use this low ESR from Panasonic capacitor, but feel free to use the one that comes in with the Teco 32 ESC. So with all that being said, let's go ahead and tin the pads from the ESC and also tin the wires of the XT60 connector, and basically apply the exact same knowledge that I shared before. So as I said before, we need to pre-tin or tin those pads. We have everything locked in, and we need the plus and the minus pads. First of all, pre-tin or tin the soldering iron. Make sure it's clean, it's nice and clean. Nevertheless, let's start soldering. So as I said before, we're gonna apply some heat first, then we're gonna tin the plus pad first. As you can see, it's nice and clean, and we have a nice beautiful bubble there. Make sure you don't heat this thing up too much. As you can see at the end, you should have something which looks like that. As you can see, it's pretty clean, it looks nice. We have 2 little bubbles, and basically having these nice little 2 bubbles, we could say that we successfully did tin the pads. Next, let's go ahead and trim the wires from the XT60 connector, because as you can see, they're pretty long, and because I will have to adjust this according to our frame, you will see that we don't need it to be this long, because basically I'm gonna put it like this, and it has to be pretty short so that it doesn't touch the propeller when the propeller is going to spin. That's why we're gonna have to trim it till about right there. So let me go ahead and cut this right here, and then let's cut this over right here. So after that, I'm going to strip out these small, or well, not small, but I'm gonna strip them out. I'm gonna make sure they're clean, make sure they're straightened. After that, I'm gonna use my helper to pre-tin or to tin those wires. I'm gonna start with the red one. The same procedure which I told you before. You heat up the wire and you apply solder. You make sure you apply solder around the whole surface of the wire. And as you can see, let's clean that up again. And let's turn it on the other side and apply solder here as well. And as you can see, we successfully tinned the wires, we successfully tinned the XT60 connector. So let me go ahead and start with the red wire first. So basically I'm gonna connect the red wire. So let's heat up the ESC a little bit, just a little bit until this solder flows, then heat up the cable or the wire, and then heat both of them at the same time. And as you can see, they start to flow, they start to melt into each other. Now let's do the same exact thing for the black wire. I mean, it's not perfect, but it works. It's there. As you can see, this is the result. Let's quickly have a look at how this is going to fit on the frame. So if we put this on the frame just like that, as you can see, it's going to be nice and straight up forward like that. We want to soft mount this, so I'm going to use this little soft mounts that came in the same box with the ESC. Make sure you soft mount your ESC. As you can see, this is the result that we were looking for, and it's going pretty nice, I'd say. Like, this is pretty much what I was looking for. I was looking for having something like this, which would allow us to connect the battery without getting in the way of propellers. Now, before we mount the XT60 to the frame, we have to make sure we install the DJI Air unit. So basically here is going to be the place where the cable goes, and it goes back to where we're gonna have the FPV camera. But we don't want that cable to go anywhere above the ESC, because the ESC may get hot and we don't want that thing. That's why we're gonna run the cable underneath the ESC. That's why we need to install the DJI FPV Air unit first. This is the air unit that I was talking about, and as you can see, this cable is pretty thick. That's why this cable is gonna have to run underneath the ESC. And let's make sure we install the air unit. Now make sure you, first of all, lift this one up and this one as well, and make sure to plug it in like that, or to insert this somehow. And again, apply a lot of pressure because this thing is tough. And same goes for this one. Apply a little bit of pressure. Come on. Apply a little bit of pressure. Make sure you slide this one in just like that. As you can see, this cable is a little longer than it's intended to be, and because of that, I like to tape this cable. So I'm going to use a piece of electrical tape and tape it down. So basically this is what I mean. You tape it down so that it doesn't move, so that it doesn't shake. Whenever you're flying, your camera is going to hold the same position. Now, speaking of this small little ESC, I don't like things moving, and I don't like things moving, especially when I have the flight controller on top of that. That's why we're gonna hard mount this using this small little plasticky screws. I'm going to slide them in like that because I don't like things moving, as I said. And this way we hard mount this ESC. It's gonna stay in one position. So we successfully hard mounted this ESC, meaning whenever some things are going to move or the quad is just gonna shake like that, the ESC is going to stay in one place, and also meaning the flight controller, which is going to be sitting on top just like that, is not going to move. The flight controller is going to stay in one fixed position. So now that we successfully installed the air unit, let's go ahead and install the FPV camera, install it on these small little things, which is basically going to allow us to position the camera at 25 degrees, which is basically going to allow the quad to stay like that and the camera to be tilted like 25 degrees or 30 degrees. I recommend 25 degrees because it's not too much, it's not too little. I used to tilt it to 45 degrees and it was spinning like crazy. I had a very high speed because I was seeing the horizon level in my goggles, but the drone itself, when it's tilted up, so the more the drone is tilted, the more speed it's going to gain because it's tilted up. Here we have the camera, and as you can see, these screws are very little screws. They are actually 1.5 millimeter screws, and I got the 1.5 millimeter right here. So let's go ahead and unscrew these first. Okay, here you go. And these green walls will actually be the ones that are going to push against the camera, and they will add a little bit of pressure and keep the camera still so that it doesn't move. So speaking of the FPV camera, you gotta be able to see this small little arrow. So there is a small indicating arrow. Basically, the camera has to stay when the arrow is pointing upwards. So basically, if the arrow is pointing upwards, that's the direction of the camera. Make sure the direction of the camera is correctly, otherwise your image is going to be flipped upside down or something like that. That's why when you mount the camera and the air unit, make sure the arrow is pointing upwards. So let's go ahead and finally mount this FPV camera. So as I was saying, these green walls have to be in this position. So let me first screw this one, and yeah, just tilt up the camera until you have 25 degrees. And then you should be able to install them just like that. So as you can see, we successfully installed these side walls, and basically these side walls are going to help hold the camera in one position, hold it still, so that whenever our quad is looking forward, whenever we see level, the camera is actually going to be tilted at 25 degrees, meaning whenever we're going to see level, the quad is actually going to be tilted at 25 degrees. That, my friends, was installing the FPV camera. It takes a little bit of time, it's a little bit annoying, but you have to do it right. You have to make sure it doesn't move whenever the quad is flying or shaking, otherwise your video is going to be ruined. Speaking of the FPV air unit, next let's go ahead and install these antennas, because as I said before, you don't want to power this thing up without having the antennas on, because you might get into trouble, it might overheat, it might damage itself or whatever. So because this is a transmitter, you want to plug these antennas in before you plug this in, before you power it up. So this is what we're gonna do. And again, apply a little bit of pressure to lift this whole thing up. I'm gonna use this special tool. So speaking of the antenna holders, as I was saying before, you could use the one that iFlight gives you in the box when you buy the iFlight XL Titan frame, or you could use the one that I will link in the description. So let's go ahead and plug in the antennas real quick. Once you have these antennas, let's try and plug them in here. Mount your air unit back into its position. And there you have it, my friends. That's how you mount this antenna holder, antenna mount, if you will. And as you can see, it holds your antennas pretty stiff. So we've pretty much installed everything when it comes to the air unit. Now let's install the motors. Let's just mount the motors. You have to also consider the fact that you have these skids, and these skids add a little bit of thickness to the layer of this leg, meaning you will have to have a little bit of a taller screw, otherwise it's not going to reach your motors. It's recommended to have your motors very tight, to have your motors in one position very strong. That's why I use proper screws. So I'm just gonna go ahead and install the first motors right here. Just use the screw, and yet again we need the 2mm screwdriver. Again, you're gonna find that in the set of screwdrivers that I provided in the description. Make sure to check that out, and let's go ahead and install the first motor. Just like that. Alright, so this is pretty much it when it comes to installing things. So basically we installed the motor successfully. Now it's time to clip those wires, and it's start to tin the wires, tin the pads on the ESC, and start soldering the motors and then testing the whole thing out. So let's jump into soldering again, and this time we're going to solder the capacitor itself. So that's why I will go ahead and install the small little capacitor which I was talking about in the beginning of this video in the component section. However, you can go ahead and use the one that they provide, the one that Teco 32 ESC will give you in the box. I will be using the one which comes in from Panasonic, which of course you will have to buy as an additional capacitor if you want. So speaking of capacitors, it's nothing fancy. As you can see, it's basically the same positive and negative leads. Basically the longer one is the positive one and the shorter one is the negative one. And also you could see something like a minus on the negative one. So basically most capacitors out there should have a minus sign indicating that this is the negative lead. So connect the negative lead to the negative on the XT60 connector and the positive to the positive, and this is what we will do in fact. So because this is a big capacitor, it's quite cumbersome to install this on this specific quad, on this specific build. That's why I will try and install this sideways. So basically I'm going to try and install it sideways as I'm showing it right here. And the negative is gonna go here, and I'm gonna try to stretch this. In fact, I'm gonna try to connect the negative lead underneath this. So I'm gonna try and connect the two, allow it to cool. Make sure you connect the thing properly, otherwise you may run into problems. Trim the positive lead with a wire clipper. Trim it down to this size, and let's apply the same amount of solder here. This is pretty much it. If you have a look, as you can see, it runs on the sideways. Now that we're done with the capacitor, let's go ahead and start soldering the motor wires. But in order to do that, we have to pre-tin, or we have to tin the ESC pads. So let's go ahead and tin the ESC pads, after which we're gonna tin the first motor wires and go ahead and test out that the motor spins correctly, that it spins in the right direction, and then solder the rest of the motors. So here are the pads. Let me just go ahead and tin all the pads. So again, apply small amount of heat on the pad, then very quickly apply a little bit of heat, then go in and go out, go in and go out. So this is how it's supposed to look. This is what it means to have tinned your pads. As you can see, we have small, nice little joints, nice little bubbles. So now that we have tinned all these pads, let's go ahead and trim the first motor wires. So specifically in BetaFlight, we have this as the first motor, then this one is the second motor, and this one is the third motor, and this one is the fourth motor. So let's take care of the first motor. Let's solder the first motor wires, which is this one right here. So what I like to do is take out each individual wire of the motor and make sure you direct every wire around this big screw, and make sure it's not too tight, because if things get too tight, you're gonna have a hard time soldering it. And I'm gonna move it around, and right about here, I'm gonna cut off this wire. And generally it's okay to have the motor wire a little bit longer, but it's not okay if it's too short, because you're gonna have a hard time soldering that. So from my experience, generally when it comes to motor direction and the way the motor rotates, you have to solder the first motor wires in the exact same order as they come, or in the exact same order they appear. So if this is the first wire, this is the second wire, and this is the third wire, you would solder it to the first pad, second pad, and third pad respectively. And if the order is not correct, you may just switch two of the wires. You will see that this is pretty easy. We're gonna test things out anyways in BetaFlight, but just so you know, from my experience, soldering the first motor, the motor number one, in the exact same order the wires appear will give you a correct result. But if it doesn't give you a correct result, just make sure to flip two of the wires. So usual procedure before you solder anything, make sure to tin those wires. So I'm just gonna go ahead and tin this wire real quick, move it around the screw, and try and hold it and apply a little bit of heat here, a little bit of heat there. Here we have the second wire. Same procedure. You move it around the screw, you move it, make sure you hold the finger here so that you don't miscalculate the length. You just clip it at right about here, and make sure you apply the same procedure. Again, move it around, solder it like that. Let's do the same thing for the third wire. So if you follow the first mini tutorial, you should get something as nice and clean as this. As you can see, we have nice little clean joints. In order to test out that motor, if it spins at all, if it spins correctly in the right direction, we have to download a piece of software called BetaFlight Configurator, which is going to allow us to interact with the ESC via the flight controller via USB. So let's go ahead and download that piece of software and then test out the motor which we just soldered. So if you open up a browser and just look up for download BetaFlight, you should be looking for something like this, and you want to look for something which says github.com, and just open up this page, and down in the changes from previous release candidates you should have something like assets, and inside this assets section you should be able to download the version for your operating system. I will just go ahead and download the one from macOS. And once that's downloaded, once that's installed, open up BetaFlight Configurator and let's proceed with testing the motor which we just soldered. So before we plug in the USB into the flight controller, we have to make sure that the flight controller is connected to the ESC so that it can, or it should be able to communicate to the ESC so that it can spin that motor in the right direction. All you have to do is connect one end into the flight controller and connect the other end into the ESC. Just like that. So once you have connected the two, just make sure to put on the flight controller on top of the ESC, and now plug in the USB and let's go ahead and test this motor out. And if you open up BetaFlight Configurator, as you can see, it connected and you have a small interface which looks like this, where you can calibrate your flight controller. You can see the gyro data. If I rotate things around, you can see that the flight controller rotates, and inside this software you can configure a lot of things, but let's not focus on configuration for now. We're gonna do that at the end of this video. However, what I want you to focus on now is the motor tab. So open up the motor tab, and as you can see, we have motors from 1 up to 8. We want to test motor number 1, and as you can see from this diagram, they are labeled 1, 2, 3, and 4. And as I told you before, this is motor number 1, the one that we soldered. So basically, motor number 1 is supposed to spin clockwise, and motor number 4 is supposed to also spin clockwise. Before we check that out, make sure to power your quad, otherwise you will not be able to spin your motors, because your motor needs some real juice, some real voltage that comes from your battery. Speaking of battery, you will use the battery which are recommended in the beginning of this video. So just make sure to plug in this battery and you will hear a very interesting sound. You'll hear something like this. ESC is communicating with the flight controller successfully, and it means they have established a connection. They can communicate over the wires. So now that we successfully established this connection with the motor, with the ESC, with the flight controller, let's go ahead and open up again the motor tab and try and spin the first motor. So before spinning the first motor, you have to check this small little box over here, saying that you understand the risk, that you remove the props and stuff like that. Boring stuff, but you have to check that in order to be able to control the motors via the flight controller. And in the motor number 1, let's try and slide this one up. And as you can see, the motor is spinning, and the motor should be spinning clockwise. And the motor is indeed spinning clockwise, which proves that we have soldered things correctly. If the motor is not spinning in the right direction, meaning is not spinning clockwise, you should just switch 2 cables, and switching the first 2 wires should reverse the direction. So assuming the motor is spinning in the correct direction, and assuming this diagram says that motor 1 and motor 4 spins clockwise, the other 2 spin anti-clockwise, it means that we should be able to solder motor 4 in the exact same order and simply reverse the first 2 wires for the motor number 2 and motor number 3, and things should be able to spin correctly in the correct direction in diagonal, as I said before. So speaking of motor number 4, we're gonna do exactly the same like in the case of motor number 1. The wire number 1 is gonna go to pad number 1, wire number 2 is gonna go to pad number 2, and wire number 3 is gonna go to pad number 3, which we have 10 in the beginning. So as you can see, we successfully soldered the motor number 4. And now let's jump into soldering motor number 2 and 3. Everything should be exactly the same for motor number 2 and 3. And once you have done that, you should have a nicely soldered ESC, which looks like this. Maybe this is not the perfect wiring, the perfect soldering, but it should look something like this. In my opinion, it looks pretty elegant, pretty clean. Everything goes inside, everything wraps around those little screws. So now that we soldered every motor, let's go ahead and open up BetaFlight yet again and test that every motor spins correctly, every motor spins in the right direction, and after that we can proceed with the build. Alright gents, the same procedure. Connect your flight controller to the ESC via the harness. Make sure to plug in the USB, and after you got your battery, try to plug it in. You should hear the sound that the flight controller is successfully communicating with the ESC. And there we have the sound. Then open up BetaFlight. As you can see, it's successfully connected. And now let's go again back into the motor section, and into the motor section, let's again check this box, and let's slide up the master tab. And as you can see, all the motors are spinning. Motor number 1 and motor number 4 are spinning clockwise. Motor number 2 and motor number 3 are spinning anti-clockwise. And as you can see, things spin correctly. Now let's move on with the build and let's continue finishing up this build. So now that all the motors are spinning correctly, they're spinning in the correct direction. Another thing I like to do is to take a little bit of electrical tape and wrap it around the motor wire so that we avoid things ripping off when we crash or when we hit a branch or something like that. So without too much further ado, I'm gonna grab my electrical tape and I'm gonna start wrapping all these motor wires with electrical tape so that they're more secure, they're stable, and they're in one place, they don't move. So there you have it guys, this is how the frame looks when it has electrical tape around the wires. As you can see, it looks much more secure, it looks much more nicer. Before we move on, I found something which is quite important for our build, and this is a lens protector. I'm going to use this 3D printed lens protector so that whenever you crash, your FPV camera doesn't damage, and this is the last thing that you want your FPV camera to experience. That's why we're gonna go ahead right now and install this real quick. And of course, link in the description. I'm gonna link the 3D model. As you can see, it's pretty easy to install and it should look something like this. It's pretty convenient. It has a very nice little protection over here, and whenever I'm going to crash, regardless of the position of the quad, it should protect the lens of the FPV camera. So what's left to install is the GPS and the buzzer from iFlight. So basically, this is what we're gonna do right now. We're gonna try to install the buzzer first, then we're gonna try to install the GPS. So if you flip the buzzer on the other side, as you can see, we have 4 pads, and specifically we have ground, we have 5 volt, we have LED, and we have buzz minus. So as you can see over here, these are the pads that I'm talking about. So first of all, usual procedure, let's go ahead and tin the pads from the buzzer itself, from the other side of the buzzer. I'm gonna put some electrical tape just like that. Have the buzz minus first, tin that one out. Again, heat up the pad a little bit, heat up the pad a little bit, and don't stay too long there. And as you can see, we have successfully tinned the pads of the buzzer. Now it's time to tin the wires and then solder the two together. So first we have ground and 5 volts. So I'm gonna solder ground and 5 volts. So the first one is going to be ground. So I'm gonna solder ground like this. So make sure you hit the pad a little bit, then hit the wire. There goes ground. Then I'm gonna solder the 5 volt, which is the red wire. So I'm gonna solder 5 volt like that. It should be fairly easy. Make sure to adjust the temperature. And then I'm gonna choose the blue wire for the LED pad and the white wire for the buzz minus pad. So I'm going to take the blue wire and solder this on the LED pad right here. After which I'm gonna take the white wire and solder this on the buzz minus pad. And it should be fairly easy. Again, go in and out, don't stay too much, otherwise you're gonna damage things. So this is how it's supposed to look. This is how the buzzer is supposed to be soldered. As you can see, we have ground and 5 volt, then we have the blue one which goes to the LED, and the white wire which goes to the buzz minus. So if you have a look at your flight controller next to the USB, we should have 4 pads. We should have one for ground, another one for 5 volt, another one for buzz minus, and another one for LED. We're gonna use those 4 pads, so it should be fairly easy. Again, go in and out, heat up the pad a little bit, heat up the pad a little bit, and put some solder on it. And do the same for LED, do the same for ground. So I'm gonna try to solder the ground wire first. So here goes the ground wire. So 5 volt is the red wire, as you remember. So here goes the 5 volt. Solder the blue wire on the lead pad because that's the lead pad. And after the fact, solder the white wire onto the Z- pad because that's the Z- pad. So now that we have the buzzer in place, as you can see, it's pretty stiff, it's holding pretty good. All we have to do now is mount this buzzer under the FPV camera. So for that, I'm going to be using a double-sided tape. I'm gonna cut about this big, then make sure we place this double-sided tape like that right underneath the buzzer, then try and mount this buzzer right underneath the FPV camera so that it doesn't get in the way of the FPV camera. So once you have mounted the buzzer, it should look something like this. As you can see, the buzzer is going to be underneath the FPV camera. So without too much talking, let's plug in the harness into the flight controller. So I have the harness from the ESC, and after that, here I have the battery. Make sure to plug in the battery, and fingers crossed, hopefully we did everything as we were supposed to do it, and we will expect a sound from the buzzer. So when you plug it in, as you can see, we have that small little sound from the buzzer. It's of course very annoying because it's very loud, but this is the purpose of the buzzer. It's to make a lot of noise, especially when you lose your quad or especially when you crash. This is why we have the buzzer. It's a safety measure. Again, it's something optional, but I decided to put this in all of my quads. It's something very cheap, but very, very, very useful, especially when you lose your signal or when you crash. All right, now that we're done with the buzzer, next we have to install the GPS, which I talked in the beginning. So the Matic GPS that you will buy comes in with this small little nice harness, which has 4 cables. So we have successfully stripped the wires, as you can see. Now let's go ahead and move on with tinning these wires and then soldering these wires on the flight controller. So I'm going to tin the yellow wire first. There you go. Then tin the blue wire. Then go ahead and tin the red wire. Then go ahead and tin the black wire. So speaking of the flight controller pads, we're going to be using a 5 volt, a ground, a TX4 and RX4 pads. Now speaking of TX and RX pads, you cannot use different TX and different RX. For example, if you use a TX free pad, you have to use an RX free pad, otherwise things will not work. So yet again, I'm going to tin up the ground, then the 5 volt R4 or RX4, then tin up the T4 or TX4. So once you've successfully tinned those pads, it should look something like this. So if you have a look, we should have ground, 5 volt, TX4 and RX4 pads successfully tinned. So I'm gonna start with the ground wire. So let's solder the ground wire real quick. As you can see, go in and go out real quick. Red wire right here. And then here's the tricky part when it comes to the yellow and the blue wire. So basically the yellow wire is RX and the blue wire is TX. However, the RX wire has to go on the TX pad on the flight controller, and the TX wire from the GPS has to go on the RX pad on the flight controller. They are basically crossed in between, so you have to be aware of that, otherwise things will not work. I'm gonna grab the yellow wire and I'm going to try and solder this on the TX4 pad right about here. So again, go in, go out, don't stay too long. And as I said, we connect this to the RX pad or to R3 pad on the flight controller. So quickly go in and go out. So as you can see, this is how it's supposed to look. We have successfully soldered the wires of the GPS on the flight controller. So I'm gonna plug in the battery real quick. Make sure the flight controller is plugged into the ESC via the harness. So plug in the battery. The GPS LED is red, which means it has turned on, which means the GPS works properly. All right, so now that we soldered the GPS, as you can see, it's pretty wobbly and jiggly. So we have to mount this on top of something. So that's why the best placement, I think, is right underneath this propeller, right underneath, or I should say on top of this leg. So to give you a quick example, this is how my day-to-day quad looks like. And this is where I mounted the GPS. So as you can see, the GPS is mounted right underneath the propeller, and if the motor spins, it's not going to affect it by any means, and it also doesn't get in the way of the battery or the GoPro. It's just a very good placement, and I think we should do the same for this quad. Start using your electrical tape. So this is pretty much it on the GPS. As you can see, I successfully secured the GPS with red electrical tape just to distinguish that this is a special leg. This is where I secure the GPS. Alright, so now that everything is connected to the flight controller, everything is pretty much powered on. The only thing that needs to be powered on is the DJI Air Unit or the video transmitter. So in the DJI Air Unit box, you receive the cable which looks like this. However, we're not going to use this cable because, as you can see, this cable has these small little wires which you have to solder, but we're not going to use soldering because we have bought the flight controller which has a harness specifically made for DJI Air Unit, and we're gonna use the cable which has both harnesses on both ends, which comes in with the flight controller. That's why it should be pretty easy to plug in. It's just plug and play. So I went ahead and plugged in the first end in the Air Unit. I'm gonna plug the second end into the flight controller, just like that. And now that we have everything plugged in, it's time to plug in the battery and test the Air Unit, or I should say activate, then bind the Air Unit to the DJI Radio Controller and the DJI FPV Goggles. So first of all, we must activate the Air Unit. So we plug in the battery. If you have a look at the DJI Air Unit, as you can see, it's blinking green. Basically means it's ready to be activated, it's ready to be bound to the components like DJI Radio Controller and DJI FPV Goggles. So now that we power this thing up, let's go ahead and download the piece of software which is going to interact with the DJI Air Unit. So I'm going to open up a new browser window, and you want to look for something like DJI Assistant. So let's look up DJI Assistant. But don't just search for DJI Assistant because you're gonna find something which is discontinued, which will give you a hard time connecting to the DJI Air Unit. Look for something like FPV Series, which will download the latest version specifically meant to be used for DJI Air Unit and not only. So I'm going to download this specific version, which, as you can see, it doesn't say discontinued or anything like that. If it says discontinued, don't download that version. Download this one which says DJI FPV Series. So I'm gonna make sure I download it for Mac. After this is downloaded, I'm gonna make sure to install it and open up DJI Assistant 2. And it looks something like this. As you can see, it's waiting for you to plug in the DJI Air Unit. In order to connect to the DJI Air Unit, you're gonna need something like a Type-C cable. So you're gonna need a USB Type-C. I'm going to use something like this. So I will connect to the Air Unit. And you gotta wait a little bit until it detects the Air Unit. And as you can see, it detected successfully the Air Unit. Let's click on that, and as you can see, it asks you to activate the device. Let's start the activation. Allow access, confirm your account. I have read, blah 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 blah, and it's activating the Air Unit. After the Air Unit has been activated, as you can see, it says activation successful. I will hit cancel, and if you have any updates, make sure you update your Air Unit and make sure your Air Unit has the same version as your FPV Goggles and your DJI Radio Controller. Make sure to update all three components at the same time, because otherwise they may not work because they have differences in versions and stuff like that. So make sure they all have the same version. Make sure they are all up to date. Do the same process for the radio and for the DJI FPV Goggles. Once you have successfully updated all three units, we're ready to actually go ahead and link the three together. So after you powered up your quad, make sure to power up your DJI Radio Controller. To power the DJI Radio Controller, it's quite easy. It's like powering any other DJI product, a short press, then a long press, and that will do it. So here you go. And after that, we have to make sure that we enter the bind mode into the radio. So all we have to do is hold up the C button, which is this one right here, the record button, and the right dial, all of them at the same time. So once you do that, as you can see, there is a small blue LED indicating that it's binding and it's making this annoying sound. And all you have to do now is, using this sharp tool, you have to press the small indicating button right here. It's sitting right next to the green indicating LED. So once you press that bind button, they will bind together, and as you can see we have a green LED over here on the radio controller, meaning the components have bound together. Now I'm gonna turn these off and try to bind the DJI FPV goggles and the air unit. Once you power these on, again, you will need to use your Sharpie tool to be able to reach that bind button, and on the goggles the bind button is very next to the power supply. So again, you have to press it the DJI style, a short press then a long press. So let's do something like this and you will hear the same annoying sound. Now we have to press the exact same bind button on the air unit, and once you press it, as you can see, they successfully linked, and now you should be able to see video in your goggles. And all that is left really is to go into BetaFlight Configurator and make sure we configure our flight controller. We enable all the switches that we need to enable. So first things first, normal procedure, let's just plug in the battery, then plug in the USB and connect to BetaFlight. So I'm gonna plug in the battery right here. Now let's connect the USB. Connecting the USB should pop that BetaFlight menu, and as you can see here we have our quad, and we have a couple of things over here. We have a couple of tabs which we will walk through every one of them. The first tab that I want you to open is configuration, and inside the configuration tab we're going to enable a couple of switches so that we have the best flight experience. So the first thing I want to correct inside the configuration is this little thing called arming, or maximum arm angle degrees. I'm going to bump this up to 180 degrees. What that will do is basically when your quad is going to be flipped upside down or something like that, it's going to allow it to arm, which is a useful thing. So I will enable that and I will hit save and reboot. After that, the beeper is going to do some weird noises, and because of that I will not hit save and reboot on every little thing. I will save after the fact, but just so you know, you have to save everything after you make changes. So if you go back to configuration, as you can see we have updated this change already, and let's move on with the settings. And something else that I want you to pay attention is the other features tab. You want to have air mode, you want to have OSD, dynamic filter and telemetry. The rest are absolutely optional. Speaking of the receiver section, a little bit upper here you have the receiver mode. So the receiver mode has to be serial based receiver, S-bus and so on and so forth, because this is what the DJI Radio Controller uses, and you have to have S-bus enabled over here. Next, let's scroll down, and if you go down and scroll right around D-Shot beacon configuration, you want to enable these two. You want to enable RX lost and RX set. That will basically allow your motors to beep whenever you lose or whenever you get signal back. So this is a nice and neat feature. And speaking of motor beeping, you could increase this up to 3. So a little down below we have something called the beeper configuration. So this is a nice list of features to have enabled, so I suggest you leave them as default. It shouldn't damage you anyways. Next, I want you to go in the receiver tab, because in the receiver tab we have to set a couple of things up in order to make our radio over here to communicate efficiently, or to communicate in general with our quad. So what I want you to do is turn up your radio, and as soon as you turn up your radio you should be able to move up your sticks, and these things over here basically should move here and there to indicate that your radio receiver is actually talking some input with your flight controller. And as you can see, I could move my sticks and these things will change. However, there is something called channel mapping over here, and this is usually wrong for the DJI Radio Controller because we have to configure it properly. As you can see, when I lift up the throttle, actually the pitch is moving, which is a little bit incorrect because this is not the pitch, this is the throttle. So in this case, it means we have to replace T with Y. So inside the configuration tab, I'm going to go and replace T with Y. So I'm gonna put E there, I'm gonna put T here, I'm gonna hit save. If you move the throttle this time, the throttle is going to change. And let's move the yaw. And as you can see, the throttle and yaw are properly configured. Basically, when you roll, it's actually pitching, and that signifies that we have to replace Y with A. So let me go ahead and replace Y with A. So let's say A and let's say E, and now let's save this configuration. As you can see, throttle is throttle, yaw is yaw, pitch is pitch, and roll is roll. This is the first thing you have to do usually when you open up your configuration inside BetaFlight. Next, I want you to go in the modes tab, and the modes tab is underneath the receiver tab, and we're basically going to configure 4 switches. That's what I usually configure. I configure the arming switch, the buzzer, the GPS rescue, and the turtle mode to enable me to flip after a crash. So let's go ahead and configure these 4 switches. So as you can see here, we already have a couple of switches configured, and we have the switch horizon. I usually delete this one because I don't think it's really needed, so I will basically go ahead and press on that thing. And we have the arm switch, and the arm switch is usually this one right here. It's the SA switch. So if you press the SA switch, as you can see, this box becomes red, signifying that we are actually arming, which means the motors are going to start spinning and stuff like that. But because we are in the BetaFlight configurator, the motors will not spin at all. Next, I want you to add the buzzer switch, and we're going to enable the SB switch in order to enable the buzzer. So let me go ahead and look for buzzer. So buzzer, it's not buzzer, it's called beeper. So let's say add range. When you hit this SB switch, it's basically going to detect automatically that you are enabling aux2. And basically we want to move the slider at around here, meaning whenever we are in that range, it means the switch is enabled. So let's hit save, for example. And as you can see, it started to beep, and I can flick it off. And if I flick it on, it's gonna start to beep again. And this is basically how you enable the buzzer or the beeper. Next, what I want you to look for is flip after crash. I believe it's called that way. Let me look. I believe it should be over here. So it's called flip over after crash. You could say add range, and I'm going to enable, let's say it's going to be SD. So I'm gonna enable the SD switch. I'm going to drag this again over here. And here you go. Then I'm gonna hit save. All right, so the next tab we have to go ahead and check out is the ports tab, where we will also have to enable the GPS. I'm gonna go in the ports tab, and where it says UART4 right here, because if you remember, we use TX4 and RX4, and that stands for UART4. So where it says UART4, I'm gonna go ahead and select GPS in the sensor input, and for the baud rate, I'm going to select the last one, and after that, I'm going to hit save and reboot. And GPS is not fully configured. We also have to go ahead and enable a couple of things in the configuration tab. So open up configuration tab, and let's scroll down where it says GPS, and let's enable GPS for navigation and telemetry, and make sure the protocol is uBlocks, not something else. And after that, just hit save and reboot. And after you hit save and reboot, make sure you enable the export mode, and inside the export mode you will have multiple options enabled, including your GPS. So you have successfully enabled GPS. Now let's move on back to the ports tab, because I want to explain a couple of things. Speaking of the ports tab, make sure to never disable the MSP. Leave the MSP, the USB VCP, leave these, do not disable these, because otherwise you will not be able to connect to your flight controller. And also don't disable the MSP when it comes to UART1, because this will allow your flight controller to communicate data to your DJI FPV goggles, basically telling you how much battery you got left, and all of those OSD features, which we will enable very soon. Now remember, we set up the modes tab or the switches tab, and as you remember, we did not configure the GPS rescue switch. That's why let's go back there and configure the GPS rescue switch. I'm gonna go back to the modes tab, and I will look for GPS rescue. And as you can see, we now have GPS rescue because we've enabled GPS. When it comes to GPS rescue, let's add a range. So in my case, I have the SC switch free, so I will simply use the SC switch, and I will move the slider over here. I will hit save. So the next tab I want you to pay attention is the OSD tab. So let's open up the OSD tab, which basically stands for on-screen display, which is the thing that you're gonna see in your goggles. So inside the OSD tab, make sure to enable altitude. So I will enable altitude, and I don't know, place it somewhere in here. Then I want to have enabled the battery current draw. As you can see, it's already enabled. Then I want to enable battery voltage, which is this one right here. And then we have something which is the fly mode enabled. I want to disable this because I don't think we need it. And then let's enable a couple of GPS features. And first of all, let's enable GPS sats. Basically, this is going to tell us how many satellites we have enabled, or how many satellites our GPS catches. Then also what I like to have is the GPS speed. So let's enable GPS speed and place it underneath the GPS stats. And the other two things which I want to enable when it comes to GPS is home direction, and let's also enable home distance. And I like to have this over here. And also when it comes to direction, you have this little arrow which is going to point you to the right direction. And this is a very useful thing, especially when you're in a new location and you don't know where things are and you're kind of lost in the space and you want to find yourself home. And I think I'm pretty happy with these OSD, so I'm just gonna hit save, and that's pretty much it on the OSD tab. Next, what I want you to do is jump into the CLI section, and in this section we will have to write commands with our hand to configure our flight controller using commands. And there are things which can be configured enabling switches or selecting something from a drop-down, but in a lot of the cases you can enable everything from command line. So basically learning how to use the command line or the CLI is a very neat feature as well. So there are simple commands which I want you to remember. First one is get, so basically you could say get GPS, let's say GPS Autobot, and basically what this does is it will get a specific property from the whole list of properties which your flight controller has. There's the other one which is version, for example, and version is a very nice feature. Basically when you want to upgrade the BetaFlight version, you need to know the version of your flight controller in order to know which type of firmware you want to flash. There is another neat feature or neat command which is called status, and basically status will give you the status of your flight controller at this time. And what I like about status, it shows you the temperature, it shows you many interesting things like I don't know, voltage, CPU, gyro, and stuff like that. But what I love about this status command is it shows you arming disabled flags, and these are quite useful. It will tell you the reason why your quad cannot arm. Something else which you can also do before you start tinkering with commands, with switches, drop downs, and options in general is the diff command. So basically the diff command will tell you everything that you already have applied on your flight controller, and this is a very nice feature because you could just save all this information onto a text file and then recover that information if you flashed your firmware for whatever reason and you lost your flight controller data. And lastly, we have the set command. So as you have get, for every get, say GPS, whatever, there is a set. So you could basically say set this one, and it's going to give you specific values which are available for this command. And lastly, the command I want you to remember is after every kind of modification and change using the set command, you would have to type in the save command. So basically save command will allow you to save anything that you have applied inside the command line section. So now let's go ahead and change a couple of settings in regards to the GPS and also disable that thing which doesn't allow us to arm without having a 3D fix on the GPS. So let's go ahead and set a couple of things in the CLI section. All right, we're back into the CLI tab, and when it comes to the GPS, as I said before, there are a couple of disarming or disable arming flags, basically not allowing us to arm our quad because of those flags. And if you type in status again, you should be able to see those flags. And as you can see, we have RX loss, CLI, and MSP. And CLI and MSP basically are there because of our connection to BetaFlight Configurator, and RX loss because we don't have the radio connected. But GPS is because we don't have a GPS 3D fix, and that is not something which we want in real life because we may switch location or anything like that, and we want to be able to arm our quad without having a 3D fix on the GPS. That's why let's go ahead and fix that. So I'm gonna go ahead and say set GPS rescue, and let's say GPS rescue allow arming without fix, and let's say equals on, and that will pretty much do the fix. And if you type in status now, as you can see, we don't have the GPS flag anymore. Save, and this will reboot the flight controller and will unplug the USB, and I will connect a battery real quick, just like that. Then I'm gonna turn on my radio, wait for it to boot up. So I will use the SA switch, which was the switch that we configured for the arming. So as you can see, the quad is moving the motor, so we can manipulate the throttle, we can manipulate different axes. All right, now that we're done configuring things in BetaFlight, we're done building the whole thing. All we have to do is then put the top plate, put a battery on top, put a couple of props, and happy flying. The first thing that I wanted to do is basically add these plasticky screws on top of the flight controller so that it doesn't move. So let's go ahead and quickly add these. So that was done. Let's move on to the next thing that I wanted to adjust on this build is basically to take this harness for the air unit, just rotate this couple of times, put it back in, and then take a little piece of electrical tape. Make sure to add in a little bit of tape, just like that. The next thing I want to do is tie the XT60 connector so that when we plug the battery, it's gonna stay in one fixed position and it's not gonna get in the way of the propeller. And this is basically how we intend to use it, and we want this to have a fixed position upwards like that. Go ahead and grab one zip tie, and I'm just gonna tie it and bend this over just a tiny bit. Cut this off, try and slide this in. After that, let's go ahead and install the top plate, which is pretty much the last piece of the puzzle. And now let's put in some screws so that this thing doesn't move. And that, my friends, is everything when it comes to the FPV quad, to the FPV build. I've been waiting such a long time to make this video. It's been a huge video. I know it's been a long video, but I had to make it. I had to put this out because people were asking questions. I was promising this for a long time and I had to make it, and here it is. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Hope you guys liked this video. If you like this video, make sure to like and share this video, and yet again, become part of this community if you aren't already. And without too much talking, without further ado, I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace and happy flying. It's exactly what I'm looking for. And it's too late. The old number 7 will do. Now what are you doing here? I told you to go to sleep. I'm just here for some whiskey. Come on, man. Get out of here.